Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG, and it is a Thursday. It is Ladies' Night, and I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are you doing this evening?
I'm good, Helena. How are you doing?
Good. Very much looking forward to the show, and as always, looking forward to sharing the stage with you, Dalia. It's good to see you. Speaking of which, coming up tonight, we've got an interview with Kieran Andrieu, who is currently aboard the Sumud Aid Flotilla. Ian Dale has called Nigel Farage a traitor following his appearance before the United States House Judiciary Committee, and Eric Adams has reportedly been offered a post in the Trump administration if he drops out of the New York mayoralty race. If you'd like to support our work, you can of course do that at novaramedia.com/support. 6 Defend Our Jury spokespeople have appeared in court, charged under the Terrorism Act. The 6, who have been named as Timothy Crosland, Melanie Griffith, Dawn Manners, Patrick Friend, Gwen Harrison and David Nixon, had been detained by police since Tuesday, arriving at Westminster Magistrates Court this morning. They faced a total of 42 terror-related charges. The charges come under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, meaning they carry a potential prison sentence of up to 14 years. A 7th spokesperson is facing one charge under the Terrorism Act in Scotland. Frank Ferguson, head of the Crown Prosecution Service's Special Crime and Counter-Terrorism Division, has said this about the charges. "We have taken the decision to prosecute 6 individuals with offences under the Terrorism Act. These charges relate to Zoom meetings held between the 10th of July and the 21st of August 2025, at which it is alleged that public gatherings were arranged in support of Palestine Action, which people have been encouraged to attend. Public gatherings in support of Palestine Action were subsequently held in London, Manchester and Cardiff between the 12th of July and the 9th of August 2025, as well as a planned gathering due to take place on the 6th of September in London. All 6 of the Defend Our Jury spokespeople have now been released on bail. Novara Media understands the judge rejected a Crown Prosecution Service request to remand them to prison. Responding to their release, a Defend Our Jury spokesperson said this: "The targeted raids and arrests of who the police were perceived to be organisers was a clear tactic to derail the mass action this Saturday, but it's had the opposite effect. Since the arrests, hundreds more have stepped forward to defy the Palestine Action ban. By not heeding calls from across the political spectrum and leading legal figures, including the former Director of Public Prosecutions, to rethink the prescription of Palestine Action, Yvette Cooper is digging herself deeper into a hole. The mass defiance of the ban cannot be stopped and is growing all the time. It will only stop when the UK government abandons this grossly unjust prescription and ends its complicity in Israel's horrific atrocities. Now, as this is a live criminal case, reporting restrictions are in place, so we can't comment any further on the details. But the prescription of Palestine Action in early July continues to create extraordinary political headaches for the government. More than 700 people, many of them older, retired folk, have been arrested by British police across the UK since Palestine Action was prescribed in early July. The majority of them were detained on August the 9th, the largest mass arrest in London since 1961, when more than 500 people defied the ban in Parliament Square by holding up signs saying, and I quote, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action," unquote. Now, since the prescription of the group, publicly expressing support for Palestine Action or wearing or displaying an article that could arouse suspicion that a person is a supporter of the group is a criminal offence under the Terrorism Act. But when you see scenes like that, it does make you wonder, is that what the police are for? Handcuffing and hauling away people quietly sitting in a square, holding up bits of paper with words written on them? Well, it turns out some police aren't happy doing it either. According to a new investigation by Novara Media's Harriet Williamson, police officers say they feel ashamed about enforcing what they've called the Mad Palestine Action ban. One officer spoke to Harriet under condition of anonymity, saying this: "I was told to help in the arrest of a disabled person for holding up the sign stating they opposed genocide and supported Palestine Action, which I did. I did it knowing it had nothing to do with upholding justice or our professional values, just to protect my job and my livelihood. My father was an officer, and the reason I came into the police, I know he would be ashamed and turning in his grave if he saw what I did. I was at the protests and stood there, people with shouting in my face, called me a pig and other names. I don't blame the public at all. In my silence, they didn't realise I had agreed with everything they were saying, but stating that openly would mean the end of my job. My managers don't support what we have to do either, but they don't make the law and they just have to follow what the ministers decide. Instead of catching real criminals and terrorists, we are arresting pensioners and disabled people calling for the saving of children's lives. It makes me question why I'm even in this career anymore." Harriet also reports this. Another Met officer told Novara Media that many officers are stuck between what everyone is witnessing in terms of genocide and what they are being ordered to do in terms of enforcing the ban on Palestine Action. It causes a moral and ethical dilemma, Officer B, who is Muslim, said. They explain that while Muslim officers face a, quote, unprecedented level of abuse, they also feel high levels of guilt for not being able to have a say on genocide. The officer said Muslim police face pushback from within their own communities, including accusations of being kafir, an unbeliever, or truth teller in Arabic, traitors. It wasn't just police officers who expressed despair over having to enforce the law. Lawyers inside the Crown Prosecution Service are disgusted too. A lawyer for the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, who also wanted to remain anonymous for fear of reprisals, told Novara Media that the prescription of Palestine action under the Terrorism Act 2000 is an abuse of terror laws against the public interest of justice, and this is clear to all prosecutors. According to the lawyer, CPS senior management doesn't openly acknowledge the abuse because, quote, challenging ministers on enacted law is beyond their remit, and such a discussion wouldn't be healthy for their career longevity, unquote. The lawyer described a CPS culture of fear, where prosecutors are, quote, too scared to openly raise the abuse of terror laws for political motives, unquote, with management because it would mean, quote, being seen as a maverick, targeted and eventually removed one way or another, unquote. Harriet also spoke to writer Donica McCarthy, who was arrested on July the 5th. He told Novara Media that he'd encountered multiple officers who were unhappy with the Palestine action ban. But there was also this particularly moving account of an interaction in the article. During McCarthy's brief detention at Croydon Police Station, he said his arresting officer paused as he was about to close the cell door on me and said, "This is mad. I can understand them arresting Hamas members, but for people who are holding a placard, this doesn't make any sense to me." McCarthy also recounted how, when the charging sergeant handed back a plastic bag of McCarthy's belongings, a white rose he'd been given at the protest fell out. According to McCarthy, the sergeant picked up the rose, looked at 3 other officers who were beside me during the discharge process, and said, "Do you know what this stands for? This was the symbol they chose after World War II to symbolize the mass slaughter by Nazism." He then paused and said, "And so very pertinent at this moment." McCarthy said he was moved to tears by the charging sergeant's words. And that's the thing, is that when you look at the reality of what these people are having to do and everything that we've been told about the reality of opposition to genocide, that we're told as a country we were instrumental in opposing during World War II, which is true, we were. We were a big driving force in stopping genocide during the Second World War. And though that history of the great history of this country and being a membership of the Allies alongside the US, the Soviet Union and others who stopped genocide in the 1940s, to be here either tacitly sitting by while genocide takes place or actively engaging in the persecution of those who oppose it is something that, to me, can be seen in the way in which these people are reacting to the way in which that this Terrorism Act is, in my opinion, being abused by the government. Early today, I was joined by Novara's Harriet Williamson, who wrote this extraordinary piece, and I began by asking her how hard it was getting police officers and CPS lawyers to speak out.
It was bloody really hard. People didn't want to speak to us. They were frightened. Police officers particularly were very reticent and they were scared about speaking out because even when I I really showed them that they would not be identifiable, they were frightened of losing their jobs. And yeah, it's a tough job market out there. I do have a lot of empathy for people who fear being unemployed, but I was so pleased that there were some brave individuals who decided to speak to Novara Media on the condition of anonymity. I encouraged officers to speak to me via a secure messaging app. I also managed to get myself immediately banned from the Policing UK subreddit for putting in a very standard journalism request. But I spent many hours over the past 2 to 3 weeks chatting to people on Signal, trying to verify my sources and encourage officers within police forces across the UK to tell me how they actually felt about having to police Palestine action ban protests and arrest elderly and disabled people.
How widespread within the Met do you think the views that you've published are?
I think that anecdotally we can say that they are pretty widespread, and the 2 Met officers who did decide to speak to Novara Media for this piece, they said that they were not alone with in terms of their colleagues' views. And one officer said that Muslim police officers in particular find the genocide going on currently in Gaza and the prescription of Palestine action particularly difficult.
With more than 1,000 people apparently pledging to break the law on Saturday, how equipped do you think the police are to cope with that number of arrests?
I think that what the reporting today that we've put out shows is that police are exhausted. Some of them are kind of unwilling personally, and that this could be forcing a crisis in terms of policing in this country, because the government are pressuring the police to carry out things that a lot of individual police officers actually don't agree with and don't want to do. Some have told us that they feel that it's an utter waste of their time. They'd rather be concentrating on addressing really serious crimes such as assault, burglary, sexual crimes. They don't want to be arresting elderly and disabled protesters just for holding up cardboard signs. Like, they want to be getting on with their actual jobs.
Now, I've noticed some criticism of your piece online. Some have described it as propaganda. In other words, that the aim of the article is to make the police appear more sympathetic or caring than they actually are. What do you say to those accusations?
Well, I would say to those accusations that the aim of the piece isn't to make you feel sorry for officers or even to humanise police officers in Britain, even though they, of course, are human and we should all recognise each other's common humanity. But it's to actually show that there is discontent within the police. And if people in police forces don't speak to us, then that doesn't come through. That's what journalism is supposed to be about. We're like uncovering things that other people don't know about and telling the public about them. And it's also supposed to show that there could be a real crisis within the Met caused by the unpopular and highly controversial prescription of Palestine action. And hopefully the piece actually encourages officers to think about what their individual red lines are in terms of the jobs they have to do and the actions they are told to carry out by the government and their superior officers.
That was Novara media journalist Harriet Williamson speaking with me earlier today. And of course, you can read that article on novaramedia.com right now, and the link is in the description below. Dalia, what did you make of what you'd read in Harriet's article today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that police officers feel ashamed. I think that what they are doing is shameful. I think that the way in which prescription is being weaponized in this way is shameful. And look, I think when we think about counter-terror legislation, the long history of counter-terror legislation, to me, it really is a form of shock doctrine politics in many instances. When you look at sort of the post 9/11 era, you see how counter-terror legislation has essentially been a way of taking a collective trauma and a collective shock that people experience, and these acts of terror like 9/11 are collective traumatic events, and they are kind of what we think about when we think about when the word terrorism is used. That's the kind of image that it evokes. And yet what happens, and a lot of people at the time, in that kind of immediate post 9/11 era, a lot of people opposed the ushering of particular kinds of counter-terror legislation on the basis that they were using this collective trauma event in order to introduce legislation that undermines fundamental rights that would not have been possible outside of this moment of collective trauma and shock. Obviously, a major part of that, major flagship principle that was undermined was habeas corpus in the wake of 9/11. Habeas corpus is a fundamental principle of the modern Western legal system that dates back to the Magna Carta. How else would you be able, and there's a reason that it exists, how else would you be able to undermine something like habeas corpus if not in the context of this incredibly emotionally fragile moment? And this is what authoritarianism is. Authoritarian regimes do not implement their authoritarian measures and call it authoritarianism. They use these kind of emotionally heightened terms like terrorism, which when the word is used, and both on a legal level and an emotional level, it kind of vacates all the kind of all norms. When you think about the packages of counter-terror legislation, when someone or a crime becomes classified as a terrorist crime, what that means is basically this act is removed from or plucked out of legal norms and the norms and laws that govern all other kinds of crime, and it enters into its own special category. That is why this idea of terrorism is used, for example, in Russia against queer people. It's used, for example, in China against the Uyghurs, because it becomes this kind of, this state of exception, this plucking out of a particular kind of person outside of the norms of governance. And so what authoritarian regimes have been doing, and now unfortunately the UK is doing the same thing, is by establishing this architecture of counter-terror legislation, which plucks the people that are subject to it outside of legal norms, and you just expand the category of what counts as terror, and you expand it, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it ends up including elderly people and disabled people holding up placards because they oppose a genocide. So when we really look at the kind of the long history of how counter-terror legislation has been used in these highly irresponsible ways in order to undermine hundreds of years of legal norms that have underpinned, our justice system, we can sort of understand how the scenes that we are seeing now have not come out of nowhere, but have kind of been many years in the making. And unfortunately, what is so effective about it is that, many people, it's very difficult to kind of, when 9/11 happened, when like these big moments of terrorism happen, it's very difficult in that moment to say, as someone who advocates for human rights, to say, guys, I know that we're in a state of shock right now, but we should be really careful about how this moment is being weaponized in order to strip away our basic rights without any kind of conversation. Because obviously the media metabolizes that as you're, an apologist, you're a terrorist apologist, which of course is not the case. The case is that we're saying these are the moments that we need to be very alert to make sure that these moments of genuine grief and trauma is not weaponized in order to strip us of the rights that we need to be able to hold our government accountable, and also the rights that have existed in our justice system for hundreds of years for a reason, in order to protect us against the weaponization of those systems of power.
Now, all of this legal and law enforcement activity in the UK involves, of course, a vast disagreement between a large section of the public and the Labour government over Israel's genocide in Gaza. The public overwhelmingly oppose it, while the government panders to it. In the meantime, Israel has escalated its invasion of Gaza City, pummeling residential areas and killing at least 54 people across the enclave since dawn today. Meanwhile, hunger is stalking the Strip, and limited medical supplies are high in demand. The impact of the two combined on the many wounded and sick Palestinians in Gaza is profound. 4-year-old Nail Abu Shelby lost both his sight and his hearing after shrapnel struck his head during an Israeli strike on his family's home in central Deir al-Balah. Like many children in Gaza, he's now suffering from malnutrition. And while he's receiving limited medical care at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, doctors say they don't have the resources to offer proper treatment. While Nail lies in a bed in presumably unimaginable pain and fear, all inflicted by the UK government's political ally Israel, our political classes are more concerned with locking up people protesting it. Well, not all of our political classes. Jeremy Corbyn's Gaza Tribunal, an unofficial inquiry into Britain's involvement in Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, has opened. Novara Media's Richard Hames went down to the inquiry to ask Corbyn about it.
We're at the Gaza Tribunal. Tell us about this event.
I proposed a private member's bill in Parliament to ask for a Chilcot-style inquiry into British policy in relation to Gaza and the West Bank. And I've consistently asked a lot of questions about supply of weapons, use of RAF Akrotiri, parts for F-35 jets, and the government's response to the genocide that's gone on. They have not been very forthcoming in their answers, and so I produced this bill which called for an open public inquiry, as I said, like the one Sir John Chilcot held after the Iraq War. And the government has absolutely categorically refused to have an open public inquiry. So I said, OK, we'll hold our own. Yeah. So we're holding a 2-day inquiry here at Church House in Westminster. It's not an official public inquiry. We have invited people to give evidence, and we've got a large number giving evidence over the next 2 days. We'll publish all of it, and it's all being live streamed today. We've got many people coming, including Francesca Albanese.
Official inquiries are empowered to ask much deeper questions. They're empowered to see things that aren't in the public eye. What are the questions that you would want an official inquiry to ask of British complicity in the genocide?
The licenses on the sale of arms, the quantity of weapons that were sold, the use of the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri, the information collected from the overflying, and why they've obfuscated now for nearly 2 years on the question of supplying parts and components for the F-35 jets, 15% of which are made in Britain. And so those are sort of pretty fundamental questions. But the other one is the moral question. You and I turn on our televisions and watch live, real-time children being starved to death, almost in sight of food, water, energy, and medicine. It is abominable, it is evil what is going on.
Corbyn went on to describe what information he wanted from the government.
I want to know what the legal advice was. The ICJ came to its conclusions about genocide. The ICC issued arrest warrants. My understanding, and many others will hear this over the next 2 days, is that a country that is charged with genocide, if somebody then continues to supply the wherewithal to them to commit that genocide, then they themselves move themselves into the frame of being potentially guilty of war crimes. And so it's a British government that has knowingly supplied weapons to a government that they know are committing acts of genocide.
You can watch that full interview on the channel just now. Now, as Corbyn mentioned, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, has been given evidence to the tribunal. Here's a part of it.
What I often say is that Palestine today is a crime scene. As I have laid out in my most recent report presented to the Human Rights Council in July 2025 on corporate complicity, and as I will be made clear in my upcoming report to the General Assembly in October on third state responsibilities, when we consider the legal obligations of states, it's critical to understand that we are not talking about occasional and isolated violations of human rights and certain matters of improper conduct, but rather we are facing a long-standing structural system of widespread and systemic oppression and exploitation against the Palestinians that has turned genocidal at the hands of Israel, and Israel wouldn't have been able to do with what it has been doing and transforming an unlawful occupation into a genocide, into the theater of a genocide, without the active support of far too many states.
Also speaking at the tribunal was British surgeon Victoria Rose.
I looked at one day's operating in May, and we operated on 6 children. We started with an 18-month-old child, that's not the youngest child I treated, with a 15% burn. We then went on to a 3-year-old boy with a 35% burn. In the UK, that is a 50-50 survival burn, and it would go to probably one of only 2 units that would be able to look after that child. I then operated on a 5-year-old girl who had had her arm blown off. She was down for an amputation, but we managed to salvage half of her hand and most of her forearm and shoulder. I then operated on her sister, whilst my colleagues operated on her mother in the theatre next door. Her sister had had her left cheek and shoulder blown off. I then operated on a 7-year-old girl who had had her knee blown off. And my final case was a 13-year-old boy who had had his left ankle blown off, and his brother was being operated in the theatre next door.
As we know, Gaza has been suffering shortages of medical equipment and medicines due to Israel's aid blockades. In her testimony, Rose went on to describe one particularly harrowing consequence of those shortages.
When we were there, we ran out of analgesia, which meant that, unlike in the UK, when we amputate your leg, we'll give you some anaesthesia, some local anaesthetic into the stump so that you don't wake up in pain. We were not able to do that. So every day that I operated, the first 6 cases would be children, and the screaming in the recovery room would not stop until about 3 in the afternoon, and we had no analgesia to give those children.
It's obviously very powerful testimony we're hearing there, but broadly, Dalia, looking at the consequences of being able to have such an inquiry? Obviously, it's not been an official one, it's an unofficial one. Or what impact do you think this will have on the scrutiny that we can put the government under over their complicity in Israel's genocide?
Yeah, I mean, at this moment in time, from our perspective, it can sort of feel like we are just sitting and watching something happen, and we are running out of levers to pull to actually stop it from happening in real time. And I think that that is a very real thing that we are feeling. I think that nonetheless, we must do everything that we can. I think the point of something like this tribunal is I think it is very important that even though this is one of the most widely documented genocides, I mean, it is the most widely and granularly documented genocides that we have ever had in human history, nonetheless, having a process of witnessing and archiving in a systematic way so that future generations know exactly what information the British government had access to whilst it continued to supply the weapons and the intelligence that Israel needs in order to continue this genocide. And just to put into context as well, when we think about the complicity of our MPs, not only was David Lammy holding secret meetings with the Israeli foreign minister just in April, not only is Israel Herzog scheduled to come and visit the UK next week, not only have, according to Declassified, 2 Labour MPs been investigated by the parliamentary committee for refusing to declare an all expenses paid trip to Israel in May. That is on top of the political, militaristic, and financial, support and complicity that we are giving to the Israeli state. And as far as I'm concerned, it is absolutely essential that when all is said and done, those people are held accountable legally for continuing to provide that support to a state despite everything that we know. And that is what this tribunal really is about. It's about saying, this is what we know, this is the information the British state has access to, and therefore this is the information that the British state had access to when it was doing what it was doing. And if the evidence gathered here and presented here, and the way of kind of archiving that evidence can be used in a future prosecution in a different context, then we need to be doing everything that we can to make sure that the people who have been complicit in this genocide are not able to whitewash their own histories and say that they did everything that they possibly could. Because we're already starting to see British politicians beginning to try and whitewash their own history of supporting Israel. With a few exceptions, these politicians aren't boasting their support of Israel as much as they once were. They are being forced to kind of publicly somewhat grieve the scale of Palestinian death. We are seeing that process of revisionism beginning to happen. And it's moments like these, and it's sort of witnessing mechanisms like this that are going to be very important so that future generations can know, and hopefully future real tribunals can know that it was in full knowledge and with intent that these politicians, that people who actually did have power to put a stop to this, continued to aid and abet an actively genocidal state.
Novara media contributor Kieran Andrieu is currently aboard the Sumud Flotilla. That's a collection of around 20 boats, which will grow as it picks up further ships in its eastward journey through the Mediterranean and towards Gaza. There are some 350 people travelling on the flotilla, representing 44 different countries, and all determined to break Israel's siege of Gaza. It is the largest flotilla yet, and by some measure, to attempt to break the blockade. Kieran spoke to me from aboard one of those ships earlier today, shortly after leaving the Spanish island of Menorca and heading east towards Gaza. I began by asking him what things were like on board.
One thing I learned that I didn't expect at all is that I apparently have quite a strong stomach, because quite a few people on this mission did get seasick initially. That was because, of course, we hit stormy weather. But no, I mean, when we left Barcelona, I think we were all kind of basking in a halcyon light because of all the sort of outpouring of love and affection that we received. from the people of Barcelona as we were boarding the boats, getting ready to launch. And that was an immensely powerful, wonderful thing to witness. And it's for the Palestinian people, it's for the people of Gaza. I mean, it's for us as well, but of course it's via us for them. But I do think that, the fact that we hit a storm more or less straight away was, in a way, a kind of important bringing us back down to earth moment. I think it was important that we understand the nature of the mission, the fact that the conditions might be really treacherous, and that there's a reason that something as big as this has never been attempted to break Israel's genocidal siege of Gaza. So, yeah, and then of course you would expect morale to take a nosedive in those conditions, wouldn't you? But it didn't. I think morale has remained consistently very high, actually, and I think that owes to, first, the nature of the people on board, all great people, and everyone kind of looking out for each other. We've been very, very well trained, I think, before coming on this mission. Journalists, as well as activists and organisers, have been very, very well trained in all possible scenarios. And I think morale has remained high as well, because everybody is just completely clear-eyed and focused on what it is we're trying to do and why it is that we're trying to do it. And so I think that any kind of, dent in or dip in morale is quickly corrected by that reflection.
On Tuesday night, drones were sighted over a number of ships in the flotilla. Tell us about that.
So basically, we were sitting around on deck. It was evening time. It was about 9 o'clock. It was dark. And one of our number kind of leapt up suddenly and said that they thought they'd just seen a drone. So we kind of jumped up after them and all walked to the edge of the deck and played a game of, is it a drone? Is it a star? Is it a plane? For quite a while. And, I was kind of skeptical. I was sort of saying, we needn't be alarmist and so on. But there were several people who have experience with drones, extensive experience, who sort of positively identified them as drones. And after a while, we kind of heard the noise. And the noise started to dissipate, came back, and so on. And I kind of, with my skeptical hat on, saw one, or at least one, but probably two things that were almost certainly drones. Now, we don't know if they were Israeli drones. We don't know if they were Spanish drones. We don't know if they were some third party's drones. Nonetheless, I think the key takeaway is that we should expect this kind of thing to happen from now on. I mean, in a way, the fact that we managed to get out of Barcelona without bureaucratic sabotage, and you can be sure that the Israel lobby in some variation was putting pressure on the Port Authority, on the Spanish government, on the Catalonian government, and so various layers of bureaucracy. The fact that we managed to get out of there without bureaucratic sabotage was actually amazing, and it kind of exceeded my expectations. So we would be foolhardy if we didn't expect this thing to keep happening. And that's what I've said to everybody on the boat. And I think everybody kind of is of that view now, that we should prepare for this kind of thing night after night. Now, we don't know if they were recon drones. We don't know if they were something more dangerous. But the assumption is that they were just recon drones. Nonetheless, it's a form of intimidation. And of course, Israel is going to use every tool at its disposal to intimidate us. And of course, this is consistent as well with the way that Israel has behaved towards previous flotillas. So the Madeleine and the Handler, some of the people on those boats are on this boat. There are obviously many boats, and this is just one of them. But they all experience the same thing: drones, and more drones. And the closer you get to Gaza, the more likely you are to experience multiple drones in a single night. So we have to get ready for this. We have to be prepared for it. And that's what we are all doing.
You're slowly getting closer to Gaza and potentially to danger from the Israeli military. How does that feel?
I mean, nobody came on this mission unaware of the potential dangers. And that's an important thing to emphasize and to stress. We know that Israel breaks international law like you or I brush our teeth, Helena. That's just the nature of the beast that we're dealing with. And everybody knows that. But I think, again, the thing that carries us through that and makes us so determined to see this mission out and get to the shores of Gaza and open up a humanitarian corridor and deliver aid to the genocided, starving, desperate, beleaguered people of Gaza is precisely that they have had every cruel trick pulled on them by a genocidal state called Israel. And we are aware that there is danger for us. Of course we are. It would be completely and utterly irresponsible if we weren't aware of that. And I repeat, we have been trained very well. We're a non-violent mission. We've had deep, intensive training to that effect. But I think the situation, the dire, desperate situation of Palestinians in Gaza is such that we all feel that it is a risk that we just must take.
Where are you headed next, and when will you be joined by further ships?
For this question, I've got Greta to help me answer it. So, Greta, where are we heading now?
Yeah, now we are continuing our journey towards Gaza after a technical stop in Menorca. And this we did to make sure that our boats are as safe as possible, and to make sure that our odds are as high as possible to succeed with our mission to deliver humanitarian aid and to break Israel's illegal siege on Gaza. And these stops are part of the journey. But now we are continuing towards Tunis, from where dozens of more boats will depart in a couple of days and then be joined by more boats from Sicily and Greece. And then we will be going together with everyone towards Gaza, towards our end destination. Again, it should be emphasized that these kinds of missions should not fall on civilians to prepare. We are working day and night to make sure that this mission can continue as smoothly as possible, and we are preparing to face the challenges that might arise, and to make sure that we respond in a non-violent and transparent way in line with international law. But this should be done by governments. But unfortunately, we have to step up while they are not taking their responsibility.
That was Kieran and Andrieu, and a surprise Greta Thunberg speaking to me earlier today from aboard the Sumud Flotilla. Now, did you know that we have a weekly newsletter? Every Friday, Ash sends the freshest take straight to your inbox, along with a selection of the week's essential coverage from across Novara media. Now, as I said, the Cortado currently comes out on a Friday, but rumour has it we'll be expanding to other days, and maybe even other writers soon. So be sure to get on the list so you don't miss out. Sign up at novaramedia.com/the Cortado, and the link is in the description. It is not a secret that Reform UK leader Nigel Farage is a big fan of the United States. He certainly spends far more time there than he does his elected constituency of Clacton. And he was stateside again yesterday to give testimony to the House Judiciary Committee, having been invited by the Republican Party. He was asked his opinions about the state of free speech in the UK, and this is what he had to say.
You can say what you like, I don't care, because that's what free speech is. And in a sense, this has all been going wrong now for a couple of decades. We've kind of forgotten the Voltairean principles that we'll fight and defend to the death your right to say something that we fundamentally disagree with. That is the absolute foundation, if you think about it, of free speech, of democracy, of living in freedom. It's kind of why we fought 2 world wars at massive, massive cost to defend that very principle for ourselves and for many, many others around the country. And I first became worried about all this with cancel culture. You know, the idea that we can't have this speaker go to a university because some people might be offended by what he or she have to say. It is important to note that there is not a parent in the United Kingdom, and I would guess it's the same for America too, that is not concerned about content their children as minors can find on the internet. Not a single parent that is not concerned about this. But at the moment, we're not finding the right solutions. I do myself begin to think that hardware might be one of the solutions, that laptops, that handsets could be programmed so that many, many apps and many, many services simply aren't available from these devices. But what we've done is to go down the legislative route. And it's extraordinary that, you know, I come from the land of Magna Carta, I come from the land that gave us the mother of parliaments, and it doesn't give me any great joy to be sitting in America and describing the really awful authoritarian situation that we have now sunk into.
Now, when it comes to the Online Safety Act, I'd have at least some level of agreement with Reform UK. I think Zia Yusuf's opinions he had on Newsnight talking about how it's very easy to circumvent with VPNs were very prescient. And with regards to the chilling effect it has on the spread of information, of course, the people who would get legislatively affected by the Online Safety Act are the platforms themselves, who I don't really have much truck with. When it comes to the stifling of information being spread because of the ways in which that you have to essentially give up your information to private companies to be able to access it, it's this structure broadly that I have a problem with. Although part of the free speech debate, we can have that discussion. But if you need to say, well, I was first worried about free speech when it comes to cancel culture, let's be very, very clear. Free speech is about the acts of governments to be able to remove people's freedoms because of the things that they do and say, right? It's not about what are essentially the customers, the clients, the paying clients of universities not wanting to have their money that they've paid for their degrees being spent on people who that they believe have views that they find completely reprehensible. Just because a private institution has disinvited another private person, this is not in any way a representation of free speech law as it comes down from a government. Again, you can agree or disagree all you want. I'm willing to hear that discussion. But actual free speech is about government legislation. And individual universities cancelling people, quote unquote, that's nothing to do with the state. Now, he also compared the UK to North Korea over how the police respond to posts on social media.
And we, of course, have the extraordinary events that we understood yesterday of Graham Linehan, the comedic writer, and he put out some tweets months ago when he was in Arizona, and months later he arrives at Heathrow Airport to be met by 5 armed police. Armed police, not a big deal in the USA, a very big deal in the United Kingdom. 5 of them. And he was arrested and taken away for questioning. He's not even a British citizen. He's an Irish citizen. This could happen to any American man or woman that goes to Heathrow that has said things online that the British government and British police don't like. It is a potentially big threat to tech bosses, to many, many others. This legislation we've got will damage trade between our countries, threaten free speech across the West because of the knock-on rollout effects of this legislation from us or from the European Union. So I've come today as well to be a klaxon, to say to you, don't allow, piece by piece, this to happen here in America. And you would be doing us and yourselves and all freedom-loving people a favour if your politicians and your businesses said to the British government, you've simply got this wrong. At what point did we become North Korea? Well, I think the Irish comedy writer found that out 2 days ago at Heathrow Airport.
Now, it seems to me a ridiculous comparison given the state of what North Korea does, right? But fundamentally, especially when you're looking at the Graham Linehan case here, sure, we can all have the discussion about people turning up, 5 police officers who are armed, and they're armed in an airport. We don't need 5 police officers to question somebody over an investigation you have into potential incitement to violence. But that's what this was. Right? They were investigating potential incitement to violence. I believe the charges have been dropped. And that's not the same as North Korea locking people up for things they don't like. It is indeed not the same as the US government who were literally locking people up for things that they didn't like, right? Incitement to violence is not the same as voicing opinions that disagree with US foreign policy, which is Marco Rubio's point. People like Mahmoud Khalil and people like Remesa Öztürk were called out specifically by Marco Rubio as saying things that were not in the interest of US foreign policy. Now, that is an explicit violation of free speech because you're literally disagreeing with the policies of the government of the day and them using law enforcement, in this case was ICE, as a way of which removing your freedoms. That is an explicit free speech violation. So for Nigel Farage to go and say that an investigation by the police, which didn't actually come to anything in the end, is somehow not as bad or somewhere worse than the reality that in the United States right now, at time of recording, they're still happy to clamp down on people's free speech just for disagreeing with American foreign policy is so unbelievably hypocritical. Unbelievably hypocritical. Now, it's the comparison with North Korea that's caused the biggest uproar. A pretty asinine comparison, as if there's anything analogous between laws restricting incitement of violence and the kind of totalitarian human rights violations that the DPRK repeatedly engages in. Although it was the disloyalty to the nation that riled up plenty of the UK commentariat. Here's LBC's Ian Dale with an uncharacteristically direct takedown of Farage.
An absolute disgrace. And I don't say that lightly. It is unprecedented for a leader of a UK political party to go to another country and slag off his own country. And that's what he was doing in the most disgraceful way. I have concerns about some aspects of freedom of speech in this country, but I wouldn't go to a foreign committee to express them. Of course, what he omitted to say was that America has this same issue. In fact, it's far worse in America. Free speech is protected under Section 2 of the American Constitution. And yet, the American government, led by Donald Trump, now forces anybody who goes to America to say what their social media feeds are. And when your application for a visa is considered, the American embassy in the relevant country goes through your social media feed to see if you are an appropriate person to be allowed into the country. Now, that is a restriction of British freedom of speech. I'm obviously flabbergasted that Nigel Farage didn't mention that in front of this committee. But to go abroad and say these things, particularly on a day when he should have been in the British Parliament scrutinising the government and asking a question in Prime Minister's questions, I think it is an outrage. He was effectively almost urging the American government to impose worse trading relations with the UK if we didn't get our act together on free speech. I mean, if that isn't traitorous, I don't know what is.
It's really incredible that somebody who professes to be a British patriot can go to another country and imply that they should use trade war or diplomacy in trade, as he described it, try and get us to change the position of the elected government of the day. Parliamentary sovereignty was his point for Brexit. We can have that discussion as well. But for parliamentary sovereignty he say should be undermined, the democratic will of our people for the government that we've elected, well, I guess I didn't elect it, but we've elected it, to get them to change their policy with international trade. This is a man, quite frankly, who wants us to be, in my opinion, a vassal state of the United States of America. That's what the Brexit paradigm was. It wasn't about actual sovereignty. It wasn't about, indeed, what it could have been, which was to have an independent economic policy that is about industrial policy and wanting to empower British workers against international capital. No, that's not what it was. It was a way of separating us from people who have kind of similar opinions upon the European continent and forcing us to be reliant on our Atlanticist relationship with the United States. And this just shows just how far Nigel Farage will go to cuck us out to the American empire and to American unipolarity, so much so that he will goad, in my opinion, the United States government to want to give us less favourable economic relationships to try and get our government, our elected government, to change policy. Again, for the first time in my life, I agree with Ian Dale. It is 100%, in my opinion, traitorous behaviour. Traitorous behaviour, 100%. Again, from a professed British patriot. What a hypocrite. Now, it wasn't just people this side of the pond who had strong words for Mr. Farage. Despite a favourable congressional invite to talk about the issue, he was also expected to face scrutiny from Democratic members. Here's how Maryland's 8th Representative Jamie Raskin responded to Farage's comments.
Protectors of free speech, but they only want to protect speech they agree with. In the UK, Mr. Farage is openly promoting the abolition of the Human Rights Act of 1998 to be replaced with a British Bill of Rights that limits the right of free speech to British citizens and legally sanctioned residents. He complains that racist threats against immigrants are not protected free speech, while he proposes to strip migrants, tourists, and perhaps even visiting American congresspeople of any free speech rights at all. I had my own close encounter with that when Mr. Farage and his team presented for more than an hour in a conversation we had about free speech. And after 3 minutes of talking, he cut me off and terminated the meeting because he didn't like what I was saying. That's the kind of free speech he's committed to. There is a free speech crisis in America today, but there's no free speech crisis in Britain. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has not shut down GB News, where Mr. Farage has his own show, just because Mr. Farage has used his airtime to call for banning peaceful protests that he disagrees with. No one has stopped him from going on Russian TV 17 times and saying also and repeating that the one world political leader he most admired was Vladimir Putin, even though Vladimir Putin is a war criminal and a dictator who has regularly interfered in other countries' democratic elections. No one has stopped Mr. Farage from parroting Putin's absurd talking points, like when Farage claimed that NATO, the US, and Britain provoked this war in Ukraine. For a man who fashions himself as some kind of a free speech martyr, Mr. Farage seems most at home with the autocrats and dictators of the world who are crushing freedom on earth. Mr. Farage wants to get rid of the Online Safety Act in his country, a law shepherded by the Conservative Party and implemented by the Labour Party, which bans child pornography online, protects children from harmful content, forbids non-consensual pornography and other unlawful content. He should go and advance the positions he's taking here in Congress today in Parliament, which is meeting today, if he's serious about it. To the people of UK who think this Putin-loving free speech imposter and Trump sycophant will protect freedom in your country, come on over to America and see what Trump and MAGA are doing to destroy our freedom, kidnap college students off the street, ban books from our libraries, militarize our police and unleash them against our communities, take over our universities, wreck our professional civil service, and turn the government into a money-making machine for Trump and his family. You might think twice before you let Mr. Farage make Britain great again. I yield back.
We might want to twink twice? I should be so lucky. But I mean, aside from his comments on the Online Safety Act, which I've already said I agree with Reform UK on with regards to its stifling effect on speech, plenty of great points there to be made. A man who fawns after actual autocrats and dictators such as Vladimir Putin, who is wanting to remove us from the Human Rights Act, which is the ECHR enshrined in UK law, and wanting to take away a bunch of human rights from people he deems as non-citizens. Something, again, that's been imported as a cultural topic from the United States. The citizen, alien dynamic is what they use in the United States in their discussion of undocumented migration over there. And the idea, again, people who will support Nigel Farage because they want to remove themselves from these human rights acts because they think that it won't be weaponized against them when those rights are lost. I think that given what we're seeing in America, that might be something that you will live to regret in future, in my opinion. Dalia, do you think that Nigel Farage is a traitor to Britain?
I mean, what I do know is that Nigel Farage is not going to have to live in the society that he is creating, the division, the hatred that he is sowing in this country. I mean, when you look at what we are seeing now, not just the kind of flag shagging, the rampant flag shagging, but the racist abuse, the hostility, the violence, the presence of highly unnerving agitators in our neighborhoods, which, not only have we seen online how that is so frequently accompanied by racist abuse, but now I have got, unfortunately, quite ample personal experience of me and my friends who have been subjected to that hostility in recent weeks. Nigel Farage is not going to have to live in that society where we are fighting each other for scraps and we are, blaming our neighbours for systemic issues. He's, when you look at admittedly, the Reform Manifesto is pretty thin on the ground when it comes to anything other than making the lives of trans people and migrants worse. But what is there is ultimately a hollowed out version of a social democratic society. We're talking about the introduction of insurance-style healthcare that is in the Reform Manifesto. We're talking about things like scrapping the renters' bill. We're talking about scrapping labour protections, basic labour protections. We're talking about so many different things that are going to be, and not to mention leaving the European Court of Human Rights, so many things that are going to lower our quality of life, to strip us of some of the remaining things that keep our society together. And Nigel Farage is not going to have to live in the consequences of that, because Nigel Farage, ironically, for one of the most anti-migrant politicians we have, the most anti-migrant politician we have, is one of the most mobile people I have ever, in Parliament today. He's constantly travelling. He's hardly ever in Parliament. He's constantly in front of the press. His 2 kids have German passports, which means that they still get to enjoy the fruits of European freedom of movement, whilst also all of us are being trapped on this rainy fascist island and can't leave, can't move out. He does not have to live in the consequences because of his wealth. He's the most highly paid member of Parliament because of his his love of traveling around the world and the fact that he's constantly being received by places like the US, I'm sure that he would love to have, instead of having to be an MP for Clacton, would love to be able to be, whining and dining in Mar-a-Lago and just, living it up with the Trumps. But, unfortunately, he's stuck being a UK MP here. He is not living in the same world as us. And so is it traitorous? Sure. But more important than that, he is not staked in the society that we live in the way that we are. And for him, sprinkling and agitating this kind of hatred and hostility and paving the way for us to lose materially the very small amounts of things that we have, such as a public NHS, the introduction of the Renters' Bill, the European Court of Human Rights, he does not have to live with the consequences of that because he is not living in the same society that we are living in because of his wealth and his mobility. But I think on the question of free speech as well, I mean, the deep irony, I think that interview really shows the way in which free speech has been so cynically and effectively used by the right and by the far right. He is sitting there, Nigel Farage makes a really big deal out of universities. The thing that he talks about as being, the primary threat to free speech is students on universities protesting against the invitation of particular speakers to their campus. Now, first of all, I would say that protesting a speaker is a form of free speech. A speaker is invited. If you want to protest that speaker and make your case for why we should not listen to that speaker, you are exercising your freedom of speech. He is sitting and fangirling Trump's America, where Trump is literally cutting funding to universities depending on key terms that are used in your research. So if you have in your research certain terms like trans, women, diversity, liberation, certain terms in your research, you will not get funding from the US state anymore. And bear in mind that the government is a key funder of research. So the way that they have flipped free speech on their head and demonized actual freedom of speech and actual public debate and used that as a smokescreen to enforce state crackdowns on particular kind of research and speech. I mean, I am flabbergasted that the ruse has been able to be kept up this long, because no one is more of an enemy of free speech than the wannabe tin pot authoritarians like Donald Trump, like Nigel Farage, like Putin, who, Farage and Trump are very enamored by. There's some kind of weird, sublimed desire happening there. But no one is more of an enemy of free speech than these wannabe tin pot authoritarians. And I'm glad that someone was able to call that out. I wish that the press in our country, rather than contributing to this moral panic around free speech on universities, was able to actually interrogate the promoters of that moral panic on their own terms a little bit more. Maybe we wouldn't be in this situation right now where Nigel Farage is being essentially rammed down our throats as the next prime minister.
Yeah, I totally agree there. It is interesting, again, how when they were crying about free speech, it was all my Twitter account has been shut down because I violated the terms of service. And yet, radio silence when it comes to stuff like the proscription of Palestine action and the arrest of elderly ladies protesting genocide. New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani is a man who defies the odds. His main opponent in the Democratic Party's primary, disgraced former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, was backed by big real estate, corporate super PACs, and the same billionaires that backed Donald Trump. Given the name recognition and funding of his opponent, Mamdani was given a tiny chance of winning the primary, but he achieved a political upset for the ages when he won the primary by double digits. Cuomo was insistent that NYC needed a mayor that could stand up to Trump, but his links to Trump's backers really undermined his pitch. And now it seems he stopped caring about the optics of being linked to Trump, however, as the business elite of New York City are openly trying to forge an alliance between those on the right who oppose Mamdani's democratic socialist politics. The triumvirate hoping to stop him consist of aforementioned Cuomo, Republican hopeful Curtis Sliwa, and current Mayor Eric Adams. Cuomo and Adams are running on separate independent tickets after losing to Mamdani in the Democratic primary. But in a winner-takes-all first-past-the-post election, they are splitting the anti-Mamdani vote. But an unlikely figure swooping in to try and shrink the field to prevent that. Politico are reporting that Eric Adams has been offered a post in the Trump administration, potentially the Department of Housing, if he were to drop out of the NYC mayoral race, to try and shorten the odds for Andrew Cuomo, as Adams is polling in last behind him and Curtis Sliwa. This is a tacit admission of a whole host of things. Firstly, it shows that Cuomo was lying about standing up to Trump. He is actually seen as the most favourable candidate to be mayor by the Trump admin themselves. Trump is famous for wanting his own way, and if he thought Cuomo would be a bigger roadblock than Mamdani, there is no way he would want to engineer, or at least try to engineer, a Cuomo victory. Secondly, it shows that for all the talk of the right wing about relishing the idea of a Mamdani victory, as it would prove unpopular for Democrats once the policies were enacted, and what they would assume would be a failure politically, in reality, they're actually most scared of Mamdani winning, in case he is successful, which I believe he will be, as it would shatter the political consensus and demonstrate that there is a better way. Here's how Mamdani responded to those revelations.
I don't care about who we will face in November. We'll beat them all. It's the question of how we can actually stand up for this city, and the fact that I'm here talking about other Democrats. I mean, what do these people actually stand for besides power? That's the question that I have for them.
Where is the outrage from the vote blue no matter who crowd? Well, turns out that was also always a lie. We have covered already how many Democratic lawmakers have refused to endorse Mamdani, including House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. But some have gone a little bit further. Here's Representative Tom Swatsey from New York's 3rd with some strong words for the Democratic Socialists.
So now you have Hakeem Jeffries, he's the House Minority Leader who'd love to be the head of the
And
House.
I think he should be. He's fantastic.
But let's ask this question. What does he do about Zohran Mamdani? Does he endorse him, or does that hurt him in trying to take control in 2026?
Listen, I have not talked to him about it recently. I don't think he should endorse Zohran Mamdani. I think it would be bad for the Democratic Party nationwide.
But President Trump wants him to be the nominee. He wants to run
against him. Of course President Trump
wants
wants that.
to make him the face of the Democratic Party.
We are democratic capital. Capitalism has raised more people out of poverty than any other system in the history of the world.
But people are buying
It has created more innovation. And socialism has failed everywhere throughout the United States of America. Zohran Mamdani and other democratic socialists should create their own party, because I don't want that in my party. I believe in free enterprise. I believe in democracy. I believe in the democratic ideals. Do I think there's a problem with affordability? Absolutely, there's a problem with affordability. We have to make things more affordable, but we have to also support the police. We have to reduce costs. We have to reduce taxes in New York State to make us more competitive with the rest of the country.
Now, he's very clear. Regardless of what Democratic Party voters want, he thinks that they must be ignored in favour of what he deems to be an acceptable candidate, and that his party should not include those who disagree with him politically. He's also wrong on practically all counts too. Firstly, the Eric Adams revelations show that Trump does in fact not want Mamdani as mayor. Secondly, socialism hasn't failed every time it's been tried in America. It's never been tried in America. Even if you take Mamdani's policies in the abstract, they're closer to like FDR-era New Deal social democracy than the socialism of the 20th century anyway. And the New Deal era was one of the most prosperous ones in American history. Plenty of other capitalist countries have social policies such as the ones Mamdani is advocating for: free transport in Luxembourg, universal childcare in the Nordic countries, and Norway even has more patents per capita and billionaires per capita than the USA, despite significantly higher taxes and social ownership. Free enterprise and social programs have never really been mutually exclusive. I mean, even socialist Yugoslavia had free cooperative enterprise. But at the end of the day, this is all just artifice for Swatsey. His comments actually underline that it is the corporate capture of democracy that he represents. Both sides of the political establishment in America are desperate. They're desperate for Mamdani to lose. Not because they're scared of him failing, but because they're scared of him succeeding, which would firmly move the dial away from the corrupt super PAC funded elite towards a politics for the many and not the few. Dalia, just quickly to finish off, what do these interventions say about the strength of Mamdani's campaign?
I think that a lot of the establishment, I'll call them sort of the establishment centre, let's say, thought that the left electoral vehicles were dead in the water, and Mamdani's campaign, Mamdani's success shows that it's not. And I think Mamdani, I am concerned by the possibility of them being able to consolidate an anti-Mamdani vote. I have now lived through too many examples of an electoral left that have played and won by the rules being sabotaged at the last minute by the extreme centre, by the establishment centre. Bernie Sanders, for example, winning the New Hampshire primary, and yet somehow, after a couple of calls by Obama, we see Biden, who was fourth in the primaries, shooting to victory. That is unprecedented. But when it comes to stopping the left from gaining electoral power, that they have won fair and square, there is nothing that is unprecedented. And to kind of quickly summarize the lens that I think we need to understand this through, because many of us, and we are seeing this happening in the UK now, we're seeing Ed Balls looking at Zach Polanski with more anger and hatred than I've ever seen him look at a Tory or Nigel Farage. We are seeing with Keir Starmer, the one thing that has been consistent about Keir Starmer, the only thing that Keir Starmer has been consistent and principled on, is crushing the left. And so why? Surely if you consider yourself to be centre-left, you could see people who are maybe more further left as being part of a broader coalition. Why is there more strength against the more further left people from the establishment centre-left? It's because I think since the end of the Cold War, since, the fall of the Soviet Union, since the kind of post-Reagan Thatcher moment where you have this neoliberal consensus, where the consensus around neoliberal capitalism is the most important thing that has to be maintained. It's more important than democracy. It's more important than everyone being housed. It's more important than people having their basic material needs met. The neoliberal consensus is more important than anything. And within that context, the establishment centre, their primary purpose, whether it's Keir Starmer, Tony Blair, Barack Obama, that establishment centre left, the primary and sole purpose that they have is to crush the left. That is their mandate. That is the basis on which they get funding from billionaires. That is the basis that they get, kind of enabled and legitimized by the press. The way that they are able to gain power is through that contract of promise that we will fight the left and crush the left wherever we can, because we are going to occupy similar institutions, whether it's the Labour Party, the Democrat Party, union within some major trade unions. We are going to make sure that the left get nowhere near, or anyone who wants to disrupt that neoliberal centre, that neoliberal consensus. We will make sure, we will do the bludgeoning for you. We will make sure they will get nowhere near electoral power, even when they play and win fair and square by the rules. And that is because the neoliberal consensus is more important than democracy. It is more important than anything else.
Exactly. It's those corporate connections. It is the interests of the people who they serve truly, which they feel like they need to have access to be able to win, that is more important than realities of the democratic mandate of the people. You're 100% correct. 100% correct. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.